wanted to kick off our time together by telling you a quick story. So years ago, there was a single mother named Joanne who was at her lowest point in life. She was depressed, completely broke. She had a little daughter, and they were just barely surviving off the little money that they had. But all that time, she'd been working so hard on a really big project, just investing everything in it and wondering if it was worth all the effort. When Joanne finally finished the project, she took it to several people to help her figure out what she could do with it next. And you know what? She was rejected 12 times before someone finally offered her a couple $1,000s to publish the book that she'd been working on. Just a fraction of what she was hoping to make back from all the time and the energy and the effort she put into it. Have you heard this story before? Do you know who Joanne is here? Well, today, after selling 400 million copies of the book Harry Potter, Joanne is worth nearly $1 billion, and we know her as J.K. Rowling. She's literally worth more than the Queen of England. But back then, J.K. came out of nowhere. Nobody had believed in her and her project. Nobody was sitting in the bookstores waiting for her first book to come out. In fact, only 1,000 copies of the original Harry Potter were released, and 500 of those went straight to libraries. Fast forward to today, and those copies are currently worth $42,000 each. But at the time, no one even thought they would get borrowed from a library for free. So the first 12 publishers probably took a glance at Joanne's work and made some false assumptions. They probably thought, you know what? My first impression isn't great, so there's probably nothing great here if I keep looking. And to be fair, those publishers likely get thousands of entries every year from writers who want to get published. There was no reason for them to believe that Joanne Rowling would be any different than those who had tried and failed before her. But we know that they were wrong. The problem was those publishers couldn't see the future based on what was in front of them. They couldn't see the potential while they were in the moment. And in so many ways, you and I often do the same thing. We look at the people around us, our parents, our classmates, our teachers, our teammates, our siblings, and instead of remembering that we're all a work in progress and seeing who they could be, we tend to just see who we think they are right now. And when we're not careful, we can get so focused on others that we miss out on what God is trying to do in us. So our theme this week has been all about getting focused on God so that we don't miss out on who He's creating us to be. But in order for us to be everything He's created us to be, we have to remember that while we're a work in progress, the same is true for everyone else too. Our instinct is to look at someone's outward behavior and then make assumptions about who they are or who they're going to be. But it's not necessarily something we do on purpose. Often we do it without even thinking. We look at someone around us and we assume that we know their whole story. And when we do this, we can't help but put people into categories, assuming things about who they are, why they act the way they do. And in other words, we think that we know what kind of person that they are. Maybe we decide who belongs at church and who doesn't, who fits in with your group and who doesn't, who's cool and who isn't, who's worth your time and who's not. Could the person that we're judging be just like J.K. Rowling and end up being a total surprise? For sure, I think so. But most of the time, it's just easier for us to make judgment calls based on what we know or what we think that we know about the people around us. Okay, don't get me wrong. There are certainly times that we need to look closely at the people in our lives, the ones who have influence over us. And we have to decide if the way they're living is good for us to be around. We have to decide if the people that we let influence us are helping us become everything God has created us to be or not. And some of us probably even need to evaluate that when we get back from this week. But that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is the way that we view people around us, people who are in process of being what God created them to be, just like us. Because if we made a decision this week about focusing on God, following Jesus, becoming what He's created us to be, then the way that we view others and treat others is a part of that. And if we're able to view others as created in the image of God, people who are deeply loved by God, who are works in progress like we are, if we see them like that, it's going to be so much easier for us to follow Jesus. One reason we chose to talk about David this week is because he was refocusing his life constantly until the day he died. He continued to say yes to God, but he never reached some mountaintop where he was complete and perfect and never had to deal with any sins or mistakes. No, even as someone who was after God's heart, who was always looking to say yes to God, his life was a roller coaster. But his life shows us that God continues to love us, no matter if we're at the top of the roller coaster or at the bottom. And it shows us that we can continue to go after God's heart and focus on Him, whether we're crushing it at life or we're being crushed by life. So David was singled out as the guy to lead Israel, to be the king of the chosen people. But there was still a season in life where David wasn't ready to be king just yet. After all, there was another king named Saul who was still in charge. And David actually worked for Saul as a musician. Like we talked about earlier this week, David became instantly famous from the whole Goliath killing situation. And eventually people started to like him more than Saul. So as you can imagine, that didn't really sit well with the current king Saul, and that's when things started to get a little bit crazy. So not once, but 2 separate times, King Saul tried to throw a spear at David while David was playing music for him. 2 times. Isn't that wild? Like, if your science teacher throws a spear at you 1 time, like, do you ever go back to that science class? Thankfully, Saul missed both times. But that's when David realized a few things. Number 1, Saul's crazy, obviously. Number 2, Saul wasn't so great at throwing spears either. And then number 3, David finally realized he had to get out of there, and pretty fast. If he wanted to live to see the day that he would become king, then he couldn't hang around the current king who was trying to kill him. So David left town. He became a man on the run. Or since he was a musician, did he become a band on the run? None of the students will get that, but maybe a few older leaders. But Saul didn't give up because he had one goal in mind: to track David down and kill him. So that's where we're going to pick up the story. That Saul had tons of men with him to track down David, who had run away to the desert. And eventually they did just that. They tracked him down. But David realized, obviously, that Saul and all of his men were there, because you can't really get too sneaky when you have a huge entourage. So David hid and he waited until he was convinced that Saul was asleep, that all of his men were asleep, before he took a friend and they headed over to where Saul had set up camp. I want you to check this out. David and Abishai, who was David's friend, went to the army by night. And there was Saul lying asleep inside the camp with his spear stuck in the ground next to his head. So Abishai, the guy with David, knew this was the kind of opportunity that David could only dream about. Here was Saul right before them, completely defenseless and asleep. It was David's perfect opportunity to end this whole thing right then and right there. His friend Abishai even said that God allowed the situation to unfold this way. He told David that this was God's way of saying, kill Saul, and he even volunteered to do it so that David could walk away guilt-free. But you know what David said, how he responded? Listen, don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? As surely as the Lord lives, he said, the Lord himself will strike him. Either his time will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. Maybe you hear that and you think that David's the crazy one here, right? Because Saul was ready and willing to take David's life. He wasn't going to rest until he did. But then David had a chance to get to Saul first, to end this whole thing. But he doesn't do it. Do you guys remember earlier this week when I talked about how sometimes the Bible can be weird or really hard to understand because it was written so long ago? Well, this is a pretty good example of that, right? I'm guessing that most of us have not been faced with a situation where someone's trying to kill us and we have an opportunity to kill them first. But we probably all have been in situations where we've been faced with an opportunity to get back at someone, to get revenge on someone who hurt us, or maybe somebody that we love. Maybe somebody talked behind your back and now you have the chance to do that to them. Maybe somebody left you out of a big group hangout and now you've got the chance to throw your own party and make sure everybody posts about it online so that one person knows that they weren't included. We could go on and on. You get the idea. But there's something that I want you to remember about those people in your life, is that we don't know what can happen in someone's life when God enters their story. No matter how well we think we know somebody, we can't know what God could do to change their story. We don't know what God has planned for them. In fact, God may already be working in their life, and he might want to use us to be a part of his plan to build them into the person that he wants them to be, because they're in progress just like we are. See, David understood that this situation, this opportunity to get rid of Saul, had nothing to do with his relationship with Saul. It had nothing to do with his circumstances with Saul, but it had everything to do with David's relationship with God. David knew that his ability to treat other people well was a direct reflection of what he thought, what David thought about God, which is amazing, because as we've already seen, David would find himself as the Saul in situations later in life. He did some bad things, but he would still experience the ways that God used him and called him a man after God's own heart. So David eventually understood that God doesn't need perfect people in order to accomplish his plans. God uses broken people and good people and sinful people and smart people and powerful people and powerless people to accomplish what he wants to accomplish. So in the moment, David chose not to throw his spear at a man who had chosen to throw his spear at him. David chose to make a different choice than Saul would have made. So here's what I want you to remember. The way that you think about people will ultimately determine how you treat them. David chose not to harm Saul because he didn't view Saul as a guy who was trying to harm David, but as someone who was loved by God. So instead of using judgment on the people around you, I want to challenge you to focus on the good in others rather than the bad. So can we stop and think about how revolutionary that is for a minute? What if we no longer determined how we were going to treat someone based on how they treated us? Not even based on how we wanted to be treated, but what if we treated other people based on the way that we know that God feels about them? Another way to say it is this: assume the best and trust God with the rest. So instead of assuming that they're a bad person, or they hate you, or they make terrible choices, assume that they're just like you. Someone who is still being developed, someone who sometimes makes bad choices but is in progress. Then we trust God to handle the rest, because he doesn't need our help in making judgments about what's in someone's heart. He's got that covered. All he asks us to do is trust him with our lives and with the lives of those around us. So when it comes to the people in your life, assume the best and then trust God with the rest. I know that this is one of those easier said than done situations, but here's what I want you to think about when it comes to this idea and how we treat friends or enemies or frenemies or teachers, parents, siblings, coaches, everybody. These are some practical things that we can do to focus on the good rather than the bad. Number one is simply this: don't throw your spear. Don't treat them poorly, even if you see something in their behavior that deserves it, or even if they treat you poorly. Your spears can be your harsh words or your bad attitude or ignoring someone, posting something nasty about them, spreading rumors. Regardless of the circumstances, don't return a hurt for a hurt. Even if someone throws their spear at you, choose not to throw it back. Number two is assume the best. Not all judgments have to be negative. You can look at people, even people who make decisions you disagree with, or who would have hurt you, and assume the best about them. You can choose to assume that their intentions are good, or that there might be more to the story than we understand or know. Have you ever realized that we usually judge ourselves by our intentions, but other people by their actions? So when we mess up, we go easy on ourselves because we know that we didn't mean it that way. But with others, we don't give them the benefit of that doubt. But we can. All right, so don't throw your spear, assume the best about others, and then finally trust God with the rest. There's a 100% chance that if you assume the best about everyone around you, someone will let you down. There's a 100% chance that all of their actions and decisions will not line up with what you would have preferred. And when that happens, you'll be tempted to think, I knew they were that way. I knew this was going to happen. But resist that temptation. They're a work in progress just like you are, just like I am, just like your parents, your grandparents, your leaders. And we don't know the ways that God is moving in their life. So no matter what, trust that God knows more than you do about the situation, which he does. King David was constantly refocusing from the beginning as he was becoming more and more of what God created him to be. And we need to do the same because we're a work in progress just like David was. And so are your parents and your friends and your not so much friends and your teachers and your leaders here and everybody else. No matter who they are or what they do, what would it look like for you to honor God, believe the best about them, and then leave the rest up to God? How would that affect the way that you see your parents, interact with your siblings, the way you talk about kids in your group or at school, the way that you treat certain people? Who they become isn't your call, but you do get to play a role in choosing to either build them up or tear them down a little bit. And guess what? If we take those opportunities to throw spears at others, not only does that end up having a negative effect on them, but it ends up having just as much of a negative effect in our own lives too. So keep your spears. Focus on the good in others, not the bad. Assume the best and trust God with the rest. It's not always the easiest thing, but choosing to follow Jesus is very different than choosing what to do what's easiest. It's about doing what's best, and not just best for you, but also what's best for those around you.